Hello, comrades. Welcome to another bonus episode of the Red Review brought to you by Socialist Action. Your co-hosts, myself, Daniel, and Emily, will be interviewing today Eve Engler, a Montreal-based activist and foreign policy expert on Canada's role in Haiti. We scheduled this interview because of the recent developments in Haiti, where on July 7th, Jovenel Moïse, the sitting Haitian president, was assassinated, and it was recorded then on July 28th. And as a result, we were not able to discuss just the most recent tragedy to afflict Haiti, which was the August 14th earthquake, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake that struck the island nation and has killed at least 1,000 people so far as of recording this introduction. This is going to be a deep dive into the colonial history of Haiti and how U.S., Canada, and other European imperial powers have so ensnared Haiti such that it really is the most destitute nation in the Western Hemisphere and plays a really important strategic role in maintaining imperial hegemony in this hemisphere and really internationally. It's a very illuminating interview, and we hope that all of you enjoy it and are able to leave this podcast better informed on what's happening in Haiti as the media continues to cover just the most recent developments.
So as we begin this podcast, I do want to acknowledge that all of us who work on this podcast live and work on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island. We recognize that there can be no true reconciliation without restitution, which includes giving land back and seizing the assets of the major resource corporations and returning them to the commons.
Cuba, for me, has always been that great example of how even with such a tiny GDP, they're able to achieve those great accomplishments like a virtually universal literacy rate. They're able to do so much with so little money, whereas other neighboring Caribbean countries like Haiti, which we will talk about, who are so ensnared within the imperialist hands of the US, the European Union, and Canada, that despite having a GDP that's more similar to Cuba than not, the people there suffer even more materially, highlighting that the solution isn't economic liberation of Cuba, it's rather the overthrowing of American imperialism. But Haiti is in the news these days for entirely different reasons. There is, again, historic upheaval in Haiti. On July 7th, sitting Haitian President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated. And at present, the precise circumstances surrounding the murder are unknown. We will be talking, right after we're done with what we know about what's going on in Haiti, we'll be talking to author and activist Eve Engler, who is one of the eminent scholars on Canadian foreign policy in Haiti, and hopefully he will be able to answer a lot of our questions.
Well, and also the media coverage surrounding what's going on in Haiti has not been necessarily the most transparent. We've been hearing lots about the protests and upheavals in Cuba from the American and Canadian media, but there have been massive protests in Haiti going on 3 years now and immense dissatisfaction with the government. But we have heard very, very little about that because a lot of their ire is directed at Canada and the US and France and the EU for the ongoing economic repression and exploitation of people in Haiti.
Haitians are also just no strangers to assassination plots. And there is at least a historical basis for assuming that there has been foul play in this instance at the hands of foreign imperialist powers. To illustrate this point, take the example of President Jean-Guillaume Sam, who was assassinated in 1915 under equally dubious circumstances. And although the United States denies official involvement in the plot on Sam's life, President Woodrow Wilson's administration in the U.S. had explicit designs to use Haiti as a point of defense in the Caribbean and had stolen $500,000 from the Haitian National Bank just the year before. And after the assassination, there was the full-blown invasion that commenced. The subsequent occupation of the country concluded with the extremely onerous Haitian-American Treaty of 1915, which explicitly gave the United States control over Haitian military affairs and finances, as well as the right to intervene in politics. So this is how America's foreign policy works when they get what they want. And this is, again, what the Cuban people have been resisting for the last 60 years or so.
So it's small wonder that Haitians are a little bit suspicious of the party line. To be sure, there are many other reasons abounding for why we should be suspicious. Jovenel Moise was no socialist nor Democrat in any sense of the term. His popularity has been very low since his re-election, which was also marred by irregularities. He was a candidate hand-picked by the previous administration, which was notoriously corrupt and had been established following a coup d'etat at the behest of foreign imperialist powers. Protests have been ongoing against his government since 2016, which was the year in which he was elected. After his term constitutionally expired in February 7th of 2021, he refused to step down, propelling even larger protests against his rule. The plot thickened as Prime Minister Claude Joseph subsequently anointed himself president with the backing of the Core Group, a group of imperialist powers which includes Canada, the United States, the European Union, and the so-called United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti. This organization was set up following the 2004 coup d'etat against former Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a proponent of liberation theology, public education, and public health care, with, we'll note, decisive Cuban support. This group has been functioning as an arm of the imperialist powers inside Haitian political life. It sets the agenda for Haitian politics at the elite level. And since the coup, has Haiti seen anything like the level of progress achieved under Aristide? There is little reason to suspect that the core group has the Haitian people's best interests in mind with its endorsement. So when will Haiti finally be free of the yoke of imperialism? This nation, one of the most impoverished nations in the world, has been systematically targeted since the successful revolution over 2 centuries ago. As socialists, our duty is to stand in solidarity with the Haitian people and expose the imperialist agenda of our government here in Canada. We must resist against our capitalist ruling class and their imperialist projects at every opportunity. Hands off Haiti now, and down with Canadian imperialism.
Down with Canadian imperialism. And so now we're going to go to our interview with Eve Engler, and hopefully you all find it as illuminating as Emily and I did. Here at the Red Review this month, we're very excited to be joined by Yves Engler. Yves Engler is a Montreal-based activist and author who has published 11 books, including his latest called House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. In 2020, Yves Engler also co-founded the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which monitors and publicizes the actions of the Canadian state and its corporations abroad. Welcome, Yves, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So before we specifically discuss Canada's disastrous role in Haiti, can you just catch up our listeners on the situation in Haiti, what it's been like since the assassination of the sitting Haitian president, Jovenel Moise, on July 7th?
It's been very politically chaotic with a complete sort of void in who's in charge of things. In fact, it seems like there's been a slight reduction or stabilization with regards to some of the insecurity and the violence that was plaguing a number of the neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince. But I think a lot of people are, just sort of worried and concerned and not really sure what comes next. But yeah, I think that Jovenel Moise's assassination was really the symbol or the final phase of just the disintegration of Haitian political life.
Absolutely. We mentioned it when we were recording the podcast earlier, but people have been protesting the prime minister, the president, for a long time now, and it never really got a lot of coverage. So Jovenel Moise, as a leader of Haiti, what was his connection then with the imperialist powers, and what was happening with the Haitian people under his rule? And what is now the possibilities or just the chaos that ensues now?
Well, from July of 2018 until the end of 2019, just before the pandemic hit, the biggest mass uprising in the world, so they got a lot of attention on Hong Kong, a bit of attention on Lebanon, Ecuador, Chile receives lesser attention. But the biggest uprising anywhere in the world, most sustained, was in Haiti. Was calling for a combination of things. One, initially opposed to an International Monetary Fund imposed austerity plan, also calling for some light to be shown on this massive corruption scandal that Moise was part of, and ultimately was calling for Moise to go. And there was a series of general strikes. One towards the end of 2019 that closed Port-au-Prince down for like more than a month. Serious uprising, massive protests, and so Moise was very, very unpopular. He really was only in office still because he had the backing of the foreign powers. I mean, he came to become the president by being basically selected by Michel Martelly, who was somebody who was somewhat well known as a singer. But Michel Martelly was really imposed by Washington and Ottawa after the terrible January 2010 earthquake. And then Moise was the selection of Martelly to run for his PHTK, very right-wing political party. And there were mass protests against Moise's ostensible first-round election win that then scuttled the second round. It was kind of a complicated process, but Canada and the U.S. were pushing this process forward the whole time, and were maintaining support for Moise even after. So as of February 7th of this year, the limited constitutional legitimacy that he had, because even according to the official numbers, there's only 590,000 people that voted for him in a country of 11 million people. And it's best to take those official numbers with a certain amount of skepticism. His constitutional mandate ended on February 7th of this year. And so there'd been a rekindling of the mass protests against Moise at the start of the year. And the Canadian officials had really stayed behind him right till the end, provided all kinds of diplomatic support, of course, very important Canadian support via the building up the Haitian police. And so Moise was somebody who was very, very unpopular. Even big chunks of the traditional oligarchs, the 10 families that basically run Haiti's economy and that are generally quite light-skinned, they even big chunks of them had turned against Moise because he was so unpopular. The most likely scenario in terms of the assassination was certainly it was an inside job. Certainly it was important elements of the government and the police force and the PHTK party that supported ousting or assassinating Moise. But most likely it was funded by one of the wealthy families, the Boulos family, possibility. I don't think that it's unlikely that Canada supported his assassination. It's possible that some segment of the CIA or some segment of the U.S. Was aware of the assassination and sort of turned a blind eye and said, we don't really care if he's assassinated so long as another element of the PHTK party takes over. But yeah, I mean, his assassination, on one hand, he was a tyrant, but his assassination reflects the complete disintegration of Haitian political life, and what's happened subsequently with the core group, which is the U.S., France, Canada, Brazil, Spain, Germany, the UN, and Organization of American States. And this is this body that gets to makes declarations about Haitian political life. A week ago now, they basically decided that Ariel Henry was the president or was the prime minister of Haiti, and that he was going to lead the government to elections that they want to have very quickly, and that this Claude Joseph and this other person who was claiming to be the prime minister after Moise's assassination, that he wasn't the actual prime minister. And within 48 hours of the core group putting out this statement, Claude Joseph fell in behind Ariel Henry, and it just shows you this incredible power that the U.S., Canada primarily, secondarily the other members of the core group have, where they can literally put out a statement and they get to decide who is ruling a country of 11 million people. And that's a reflection of a couple parts. One, just the total disintegration of Haitian political life. Also, how sort of imperially penetrated the country is, and that has a whole broader history that we might want to get into in further detail.
I wonder if you could go into a bit more detail with exactly like how do all of these imperialist interventions and this political turmoil, how does it affect the material day-to-day conditions of Haitian people?
Well, Haiti is the most impoverished nation in this hemisphere. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it's like 60% of the population gets by on less than $2 a day. The minimum wage is ridiculously low. As a very concrete example, when René Préval, a sort of social democratic president that came to office after the coup in 2004, who the US and Canada really tried to block from winning the presidency, when he tried to increase the minimum wage from like 31 cents an hour to 60 cents an hour, the US and Canadian officials, lobbied aggressively against doing that. And we have all the internal documents because of WikiLeaks showing just how aggressive they were with that lobbying campaign. So that's a very concrete example of the material conditions of primarily women working in the sweatshops in Port-au-Prince for companies like Guild and Activewear, or their subcontractors, Guild and Activewear being a Montreal-based company, that the imperial intervention undercuts them being paid 60 cents an hour. So, but I think at a more macro level, I mean, Haiti is it doesn't really have an economy. I mean, it doesn't export almost anything. I mean, even in the sweatshops, they don't even necessarily produce the whole t-shirts, right? Like, because electricity is so expensive in the country, because everything's so dysfunctional, that the sort of more energy intensive parts of some of the apparel production is actually done in the Dominican Republic or elsewhere, and that the really high labor intensive parts, because they pay people so little, that those elements are done in Haiti. And so, it doesn't even necessarily produce full t-shirts, let alone, I mean, if you look at what Haiti exports, I mean, it imports almost everything. And that's what when I talk about these like 10 families that run the economy, what they really do is they run the import, they control the imports into the country, and very little rice production, very little milk. So much of what Haitians eat is actually imported from far, and in fact, often not cheap either. It's often quite expensive. Unlike some other kind of poorer places that have major internal agriculture, at least sectors. And basically, what the Haitian economy is based on is people who've left the country sending money back, right? It's people of Haitian descent in Canada and the US and Dominican Republic and elsewhere sending money back into Haiti, remittances, and that's like a third of the economy. So you have that, and you have some money that goes in via international aid projects, missionary initiatives. And so that's largely what sustains the Haitian economy. So it's the material conditions of average Haitians are terrible. And the history of that, I mean, you got to go back all the way to the Haitian Revolution, and this was the richest place in the world. I mean, this was the French gave up big chunks of Canada to keep Haiti, because Haiti was the source of incredible wealth in the capitalist class and aristocracy in France made incredible sums off the sweat and blood of the Africans that were stolen and brought to Haiti and put in horrible plantation conditions. The cycle of Haitians sort of breaking from imperial domination. I mean, there was this incredible break with the Haitian Revolution, but immediately Haiti was stuck in a world that was very hostile to it. And that's really continued in today. And then, in the last 20 years, you have the Canadian government being, a second after the US, the second player in basically undermining efforts by the poor to try to break free from their impoverishment and break free from their domination by a combination of the oligarchy in the country and Washington-led empire.
Yeah, actually, so we're going to ask if you could go into a bit more detail for those who don't know about the history of Haiti as a slave colony and their successful revolution. What were the economic impacts of that and the sanctions that they faced in the aftermath of the revolution?
Well, the Haitian Revolution is probably the greatest example of human liberation in the history of humanity. I mean, you went from the most barbaric of the plantation economies. I mean, what happened in the U.S. South looks like pleasant compared to what happened to the Africans in Haiti, and they revolted in 1791, and it was a 13-year rebellion. That's a incredibly complicated political dynamic, shifting dynamics, but effectively the Haitian masses defeated the French Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish, the U.S. supported different periods as well, and created a place where all people were considered equal. Decades and decades before that idea had any traction, and any mass traction. And it was, of course, incredibly threatening to the whole slave system that dominated in the Caribbean, dominated in the south of the U.S., much of South America, and they were completely isolated from after 1804. After they declared independence, were isolated internationally, and the U.S. didn't recognize Haiti until 1862, until after slavery was abolished in the U.S. But probably the most important element of that to understanding how impoverished Haiti is today is that the French, 20 years later after independence, and it actually began the process the whole way through, but in 20 years later, they succeed in basically demanding that the Haitian government pay a debt of independence for France's lost property. So not only did like half of the population die of the Haitian population of the African slaves die during the revolution, but they paid for the lost property, which was the land and themselves, right? So they paid France for having liberated themselves. And why this process ends up working out how it does, with the Haitian government agreeing to make this payment, is it was a complicated political process that has to do with divisions within Haitian society among the elites, who were very French, continued to be French centric, and who wanted to, as you referred to, the sanctions, they wanted to be able to trade internationally. They kind of wanted to return to some element of the previous slave plantation economy, and to do that, they needed to be able to trade with France and other countries. So they agreed to this debt of independence, which took 122 years for Haiti to pay off. In 2003, the then elected government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide calculated that worked out to $21 billion. And so even into the late 1800s, more than 60% of Haiti's government's budget was going to pay France for having won their liberation from slavery and their independence. That had a devastating effect on Haitian economic and social and political life, and that's an effect that you still see right up until today. Haiti has been a country that has really it's been independent for 200 plus years now, but it has faced every different form of neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism that you can imagine, from gunboat diplomacy, where European, U.S. Repeatedly sent gunboats, including some that came from Halifax in the late 1800s, to intimidate the Haitian government to make some sort of payment to it's been caught into a position of indebtedness to the leading capitalist powers since the time of the 1825 payment of debt of independence. It's been, the U.S. Occupied Haiti for 20 years, from 1915 to 1934. Maintained control of Haiti's finances for another decade. Just before occupying Haiti, one day the U.S. Marines just landed in Port-au-Prince, went to the Bank of Haiti, and just took all the gold. Literally, just like stole all the gold, put it on a ship, and sent it to New York. I mean, the history of imperial viciousness towards Haiti is long-standing, and unfortunately is very active right until today.
We talked this month on the podcast a lot internationally. We talked about Haiti. We also talked about Palestine, but we also talked about Cuba. Now, Cuba is another Caribbean nation, similar population, but they had a socialist revolution this century or 60 years ago. And you see very, very different material conditions. And also to this day, very different reporting or lack of reporting on what's happening in these different countries, where Cuba now is in the media for fairly small protests, whereas we already talked a bit what was happening in Haiti to oppose Moise, and that never really got the same traction. So do you want to maybe talk a little bit about how then Cuba went a different route and how that plays out and what you see materially today, but then also how the mainstream media is just continuously manufacturing consent, both with respect to Cuba and Haiti?
Yeah, the month-long general strike in Haiti in October, November of 2019 probably got like 10% of the media attention that the 1,000 people, 500 people, whatever the number was exactly in Havana protesting one time has received, right? Just completely out of proportion. Probably one of the most important ways in which the media is the dominant media is complicit in Canadian imperialism is by basically ignoring uprisings, protests that challenge Ottawa's policy, and giving incredible amount of attention to protests that align with Ottawa or Washington's policy. Probably the starkest example is Hong Kong protests versus the protests in Haiti, and I wrote about that back in 2019. There's no doubt. I mean, one of the reasons for different interventions and for backing François Duvalier and then Jean-Claude Duvalier, the 30-year dictatorship from the 50s to the mid 80s in Haiti, was a fear of what had happened in Cuba with the Cuban Revolution. And I don't know, I've never seen polling on this. I'd be very interested to see it. But people from afar, there's Cuba, there's lots of criticism or bad of Cuba, or the Cuban Revolution did this or that, and there's not enough democracy, or these different criticisms. I bet you if you did a poll of Haitians, you'll find that 90% of the population looks on what happened in Cuba and has happened in Cuba for 60 years in a quite favorable light next to their conditions. So one of the things that they hated, Washington hated Jean-Bertrand Aristide for, was when he returned in the mid 90s after the first coup against him, was beginning opening up diplomatic relations with Cuba, which go back to François Duvalier voting to kick Cuba out of the Organization of American States. And they had begun, one of the things that they destroyed after the 2004 coup in Haiti that the U.S., Canada, and France perpetrated, was they had the Aristide Foundation had built a second medical school in Haiti, and it was Cuban doctors that were doing the teaching primarily, and the UN occupation actually took over the school, and they made it their own. They made it their compound and ended the medical school. Fortunately, there was like hundreds of Haitian, young Haitians that all of a sudden had their training disrupted. Fortunately, my understanding is that most of them, the Cubans, took most of them to Cuba to be able to continue that training process. But there's no doubt, part of in the background to U.S. Canadian treatment of Haiti is really a fear that Haiti might go in the direction of Cuba and break free from that grip of U.S. domination.
If I may inquire as well, as you said, from 1915 until 1934, the US directly occupied Haiti and then controlled their economy for many more years. We understand the economic incentive of, cheap forced labor. What were the other motivations of the United States occupation of Haiti and continued presence in Haiti?
Yeah, well, with the U.S. occupation, obviously that's during World War One. So it was a geopolitical competition going on between Washington and Germany and France, but that was during World War One. So there was some element of the U.S. Occupation being about solidifying U.S. control in the context of German and French influence. That was secondary to the economic motivation. And I think a central part of that economic motivation of the U.S. occupation was that after the Haitian Revolution, for pretty good reason, the Haitians put in legislation that said that foreigners couldn't own land, right? I mean, it's been a pretty bad history of foreigners owning land and a fear of returning to slavery and all that stuff. And so the Americans didn't like that, of course, and that they rewrote the Haitian Constitution quite quickly after invading in 1915 and opened it up to foreign companies. And there was quite a growth of foreign U.S. companies at that period. In fact, the Royal Bank of Canada began its operations in Haiti in 1919 alongside the U.S. occupation. There was some other Canadian insurance companies that became players. And actually, Royal Bank was one of only two banks operating in Haiti for quite a while. And they had actually some of their top employees later became president, and they were involved in funding some of that political activity. And so I think that's historically part of it up until today. Now, so clearly the thing that Haiti offers most importantly, as you mentioned, to sort of global capitalism is cheap labor. And it's not just a matter of cheap labor from the standpoint of that there's tons of production taking place in Haiti that has sort of gone up and down. And during periods of the Jean-Claude Duvalier in the early 1980s, there was actually, 60,000 people employed in the sweatshops in Port-au-Prince. It was quite a thriving industry. And they produced most of the baseballs that were, used in the US and stuff like that. That has declined drastically over the years, mostly depending on different sort of political dynamics. Now, I don't know the exact number. It was Gildan Activewear, Montreal company, was the second biggest employer in Haiti. I'm not sure that's still the case, but from the sort of late 2008 to 2015, they were viewed as the second biggest employer in Haiti with about 8,000 employees, and from a mix of their own manufacturing or their assembly making, I guess, and primarily subcontracting to local oligarchs, and including their main subcontractor at the time of the 2004 coup was the André Aped, who was the head of the opposition to the elected government. He was the main person campaigning to overthrow the elected government. Canadian company very deeply tied to pro-coup force. The cheap labor in Haiti is also of value in terms of weakening union organizing and workers' rights elsewhere, right? It's basically, you can say to the people in Honduras, Gildan has major operations in Honduras, that if you try to move your wages up to $3 an hour right now, I don't know what, I think they're probably about $1.50, $2 an hour in Honduras. If you try to move them up to $3 an hour, we can always move to Haiti. And so it's been a way of dampening pressure on workers' movements throughout the hemisphere. We have U.S. and Canadian officials, including like the aid officials of like Canadian International Development Agency, on record of like what Haiti offers is this competitive advantage on wages, which is another way of saying what Haiti offers is its impoverishment. And so, but this is like Canada's development officials saying this stuff, right? So it's like, well, what's the development in that, right? So that's an important part of it. There's been mining interests. At one point, a Canadian company had prospecting rights for 10% of Haitian territory. There's a Canadian mining company going back into the 50s during François Duvalier that was working with the regime at that period, and there's been a more recent phase of mining. Most of that hasn't really panned out. They've put a lot of pressure on Haitian politicians after the coup in 2004 to put a lot of pressure to rewrite the mining code and to basically open it up completely to the mining sector, and which of course is not that, you know, it's mostly in the north of the country. The peasantry wants nothing to do with this, right? They know that they're just going to be displaced, and it's going to lead to all kinds of ecological damage and whatnot. So there's some mining interests. You know, Canadian banks have continued to be in Haiti and have been in Haiti. But if you take Haiti's economy, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if like York University is like more, you know, bigger economic output than all of Haiti, right? So from a standpoint of like global capitalism, Haiti is of incredibly limited importance. But it's basically to understand the, you know, sort of the viciousness of the imperial policies. I don't think you can understand it from a simple sort of dollars and cents, but rather that Haiti it's at the bottom of this imperial system, and modest efforts to move it out from the bottom of this imperial system are threatening to the imperial system and need to be crushed. And that's what the best explanation of what they did to Aristide in 2004. He refused to privatize some state-owned companies. And again, these state-owned companies, from the standpoint of Canadian capital, completely inconsequential. But from the standpoint of if Haiti can do this, if Haiti can resist the dictates of Washington and the IMF and Ottawa, that's a bad symbol for Guatemala. And Guatemala means a bit more to global capitalism. And then if Guatemala, next thing you know, you got Honduras. Next thing you know, you got Venezuela. Next thing you know, you got Mexico. And that matters from global capitalism. And then alongside that is you have, I think, a really important racist component. And I think you have an anti-blackness, and you have a specifically anti-Haitian dynamic. And some of that traces all the way back to Haiti's successful slave revolution and how threatening that was to the dominant white supremacist order. And Haiti has been basically demonized since that time, and that continues to shape understanding of Haiti. And it's partly about what they can get away with, right? Like Haiti is not in a well positioned to resist, and there's all kinds of elements to that, even just from simple kind of linguistic elements, right? The fact that the language is not a language that's spoken anywhere else. And so, so if you speak Spanish, or even if half the country, like, someone like Guatemala, lots of Mayan language, but if most of the country speaks Spanish, that offers you the ability to, communicate with the rest of the world, and, in some ways resist efforts to overthrow your government, or, weaken your popular movements or whatever. Haiti's, further compounded its isolation, linguistically, and that just, one more element to the sort of the ability for Haiti and Haitians to resist U.S. and Canadian policies.
So this all actually reminds and even puts into more context, but during the AIDS crisis, Haiti was also uniquely singled out. And even in Canada, Haitians were deferred from donating blood as an entire population, regardless of any individual behaviors or not. And they were the only country singled out in such a racist, discriminatory act. And when you put it in this context, it makes a lot of sense. Then even 200 years after their slave rebellion, they've still been marked in that way. Now, you're from Montreal. Montreal is a very big Haitian population, from what I understand, relatively speaking, in terms of the diaspora. And you already even mentioned that people sending money back to Haiti is such a big source of just revenue in Haiti. So in Montreal right now, what is going on in the Haitian community there? What is the actions that people are leading to put pressure on Canada to take their hands off of Haiti? And what are groups like the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute then doing on the ground there as well?
Yeah, I mean, actually, today there's a rally in front of the Haitian consulate here in Montreal. There was one about 5 days or so after the assassination of Moise, and that's organized by people who are saying that from the Haitian community, who are saying that you have to, stop with the foreign interference, Canada out of the core group. But unfortunately, the mobilization of the Haitian community is not very strong. After the 2004 coup, there was, the 1 year anniversary is probably the biggest demonstration I saw. It was about 400 people from the Haitian community that demonstrated on a very, very cold February day. But as a general rule, the Haitian community is very demobilized. It's been a lot of bad news at this point with Jovenel Moise, just before his assassination. It was the intellectual sector of the Haitian community in Montreal were hostile to Jovenel Moise. That wasn't the case in 2004. In 2004, with the coup against Aristide, the intellectual sectors were very much supportive of the coup. So the Haitian community at that period was quite divided on the U.S. and Canada's intervention. With Moise, that's not the case. Moise is more like during the time of the Duvalier. By the end of the Duvalier dictatorship, it was closing in on sort of unanimity, 80%, 90% who were hostile to Duvalier, and I think that was more the case with Moise recently. But very little, very demobilized, and demobilized. I mean, it's been just so much bad news. I mean, from the earthquake and all the horrors of the 2010 earthquake to cholera and different natural disasters. It really is been a lot of bad news. So my impression is that people in the Haitian community in Montreal mostly don't want to think about it too much. They're uncomfortable with criticizing Canada. There's a lot of discomfort with directly challenging Canadian imperialism, especially Trudeau. The Liberal Party, of course, receives most of the Haitian community votes for the Liberal Party. So there's hesitancy there. The mobilization, I mean, I'm part of this group, Solidarité Québec Haïti, and we've done some stuff on the issue. Canadian Foreign Policy Institute has also done some stuff. There's a very good film people can check out about Canada's role in the coup, and it kind of goes up to pretty close until today, from Hélène Brière. We put out Canadian Foreign Policy Institute in February when Moise became, his little constitutional legitimacy ended. We put out a statement that was signed by a bunch of prominent people calling on Canada to stop backing Moise. There's been a couple of parliamentary petitions that calling for Canada to release the documents around the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. And so basically in 2003, the Canadian government organized a meeting with US, French, and Organization of American States officials where they decided that the elected president must go, Haiti should be put under UN trusteeship, and the Haitian military should be recreated. 13 months later, Aristide was forced out by US Marines with Canadian troops patrolling the airport. Haiti was put under UN, basically sort of been under UN control since then, kind of differing phases, and the Haitian military has been recreated. So Canada was involved in this incredible, sort of plotting, if you like, against an elected government. And so recently there were some new internal government documents that were released on that issue due to a parliamentary petition by the Green Party MP Paul Manley, and actually the Breach media outlet just published a very good story on that. So there's some activity. I was talking to a member of the Canada Haiti Action Network, which was a group that we set up after the 2004 coup across the country, and we did all kinds of campaigning against Canada's role in Haiti. Things didn't really change in one sense, but what we've seen recently with some of these, like this public letter that we put out in February, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, it was signed by like David Suzuki and Stephen Lewis and people who are sort of, well known on the, sort of progressive or NDP circles. And the fact that these people were willing to sign it was kind of because I think of this like 15 years of Haiti solidarity activism that had kind of seeped out a certain amount of knowledge and criticism of Canada's role in Haiti. And there's a sense out there that, Canada's doing bad things in Haiti. And even after the assassination of Moise, the corporate media provided a certain amount of space for that kind of perspective to come out, which I think is somewhat different and partly due to all this activism that is sort of built up over the last 15 years. Now, is it enough? Is it where it should be? Of course not. But there is a certain level of consciousness that's been developed that the Haiti solidarity has succeeded on. Now, to really change Canadian policy, I think what you really need, the most realistic way of changing Canadian policy on Haiti is the Haitian community of Montreal getting mobilized, asserting its power with the progressive left in Quebec. That's the alliance that has the most realistic possibility of really causing serious trouble for the government. And there's bits of it. We've seen bits of it in over the past few months in challenging Moise and the PHTK, but it's still there needs to be a lot more mobilization for that to really start costing the Trudeau government.
As we're kind of wrapping up here, I would love to hear, what do you think is, especially in the aftermath of the assassination of Moise, what does the future look like for Haiti?
Well, I don't think the future looks good for Haiti. There's no sort of great solution on offer. There is a procedure. So when the core group, as I mentioned earlier, that they appointed Ariel Henry to lead the PHTK party and to go to elections. And that's basically what they wanted the core groups trying to do, is they're trying to unite this far right political party all behind their person and to move forward with elections that they want to have happen right away, because they want the sort of legitimating elements that come with elections, and they know that the circumstances right now is there's no chance of having anything approaching a legitimate election. It's going to be very easy for them to arrange the result. Even if they don't arrange the result, just the fact that the population doesn't have any trust in the situation means that people are not going to vote, which is in the favor of the PHTK party and the US and Canada. There's a proposal that a large sector of Haitian political and civil society life has come behind, of trying to come up with a consensus government that will lead for a medium term, year, 2 years, try to regenerate a few of the institutions, because none of that, basically all the institutions are not legitimate right now in Haiti, right? The people that the core group is saying are the prime minister, they've been appointed by the core group after they were appointed by the de facto president who's lost his constitutional legitimacy. They never got okayed by the Senate and the legislature, because those aren't functioning as they're supposed to be by the Haitian constitution. It's a real disintegration of the institutions of the state. And also simultaneously, you have this terrible violence. Moise's assassination was, there are just tons and tons of killing, tons of kidnapping in Port-au-Prince in the months before that. The idea that you can just have some quick election and that's going to deal with the problems doesn't make sense. And that's not what this big coalition of Haitian political actors. And I say big coalition, I mean, these are people from, people that I like, the cousin of the person who, Yuri Latortu, who was the Gérard Latortu was the person they imposed after the US, France, and Canada overthrew Aristide's government in 2004. That's who they imposed Gérard Latortu as the prime minister. And so Yuri Latortu, so somebody from from a right-wing, almost certainly drug-running, corrupt politician, people like that, to the Petit Desailly and the Famille Lavalas, two political parties, of the left. That's part of this coalition trying to have some sort of consensus government. So it's not a government that we would be like, this is not like the ideology that I or many left-wing Haitians would be putting forward, but basically just a certain degree of stability, moving aside this PHTK party that's this really right-wing, corrupt, violent force. The coalition of civil society and political groups in Haiti encompasses broad spectrum of political ideology, and the idea is to have this coalition government until it's possible to have close to reasonable elections. And that's part of what the core group decision to get behind Ariel Henry is about, is to undercut this effort to have a consensus government, because it's preferable from Washington and Ottawa's perspective to the PHTK party is preferable, and also for them to move towards elections, which will be easy to manipulate. So that's a solution, a political solution that's on offer right now, and it should be supported from the outside to the extent that we can support it. But I think the main thing that we can do from outside of Haiti is to call on Canada to get out of the core group. Right? It's totally absurd that there's this group of foreign ambassadors that puts out statements about Haitian affairs regularly, and that these statements have huge political effect. Imagine that the Jamaican, Congolese, Guatemalan, and Filipino ambassador in Ottawa got together and periodically put out statements and said, hey, this is who should be the Prime Minister of Canada. That would not be a good idea. It's totally outlandish, but that's what happens in Haiti. And so there's no justification for the core group to exist, and there's no justification for Canada to be the second main player in the core group. So I think that's a demand that the progressive and socialist anti-imperialist movements in Canada should easily be able to rally behind. There's other demands, I think, that are important demands that are a bit more complicated, but shouldn't be that complicated, like ending our support for the Haitian police, right? Canada has spent certainly more than $100 million, probably into the hundreds of millions of dollars, building up the Haitian police force since the 2004 coup. They frame it as trying to professionalize the police, and there's elements of truth within that, but mostly what they're doing is they're building up the security apparatus to maintain an incredibly unequal Haitian economic situation. And it's a force designed to protect the tiny Haitian elite and their international backers. And if we believe that we should be defunding the Canadian police, with lots and lots of problems the Canadian police have, and I agree with that demand, certainly defunding the Haitian police is demand that we should get behind. And Canada, and it's not just, the police are involved in really political. Just a couple months ago, the Canadian ambassador Stuart Savage in Port-au-Prince was at a function for a police academy function, which the Canadian ambassador go to very regular in Haiti, and the Interior Minister of Jovenel Moïse announced that the police were there to enforce the constitutional referendum. This is a completely dubious constitutional referendum that the Moïse was trying to push, and the idea that openly saying that we're basically the security force that Canada's paying for is designed to push this, something that was rejected by the vast majority of the population, just speaks to how politicized the whole police training is. There's other just simple demands. The two parliamentary petitions talked about, releasing the documents, right? We haven't got a full accounting of what happened in the Ottawa Initiative in Haiti, where we, plan to overthrow the elected government. And so there's, just simple requests of the Canadian government of, releasing of information, which of course are, educational. We're not just asking for those documents to be released because there's going to be tons more details. There probably will be more details, but it's a broader, let's remember how part of why why Haiti's gotten to where it is today is because Canada, the US, destroyed the most popular political party in Haitian history, the Famille party, and we did that through a whole series of measures, but including having this meeting where we plan to overthrow that government. So there's a lot of demands that are I don't think that complicated, that people can rally behind here. Now, how do we operationalize those demands? There is an effort, like I mentioned, Solidarité Québec Haïti is a group I'm involved. We do campaigning stuff. There's this rally here in Montreal today. There's an effort to recreate the Canada Haiti Action Network that's just beginning to be discussed among some former Haiti solidarity activists. There's Kevin Edmonds, a prof at University of Toronto, has been involved in some of this Haiti solidarity, continued some of this Haiti solidarity activism over, in recent years. So, it's not much different than other campaigns. It's a mix of like knowledge building, educational stuff, and concrete campaigning. And I think an important one would be calling on Canada to get out of the core group and putting that onto the sort of political discussion in this country.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Yves, for coming on to the Red Review and providing this educational background, providing that base of knowledge so that people can take that out into the world, into their interactions, and we can develop a more cohesive foreign policy model to explain what Canada is doing abroad. So thank you once again for joining.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And then if you wanted to learn more about Eve Engler, his work, but also the work of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and the other groups that Eve mentioned, or any of the groups that we mentioned during this podcast, just look in the description and you'll find links to Twitter accounts, to websites, to GoFundMes, and every other way that you can very quickly get involved and build up your own involvement in these struggles. Any last words, Eve? Anything you want to just shout out, book projects or anything?
I have a book called Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military that is forthcoming in August. And hopefully I'll have the opportunity to do a bit of touring on that, depending on the pandemic situation.
Great luck with that. And thanks once again. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.